Well, we continue in Genesis chapter 6. God is now talking to Noah. And I was going to start reading in verse 14, but it is better to start reading in Genesis 6:13, and then we'll see how far we get. In verse 13, God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Verse 14, "Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shall you make in the ark. You shall pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which you shall make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. The breadth of it 50 cubits. And the height 30 cubits. A window shall you make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shall you set in the middle thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shall you make it." Wow, that sounds like a complicated plan, doesn't it? But Noah was given 100 years to build it. Can you believe that? Can you imagine that? Now, previously we said the list of ages in the pre-flood history shows a total of 1,656 years. I want you to imagine that for a moment. That's the years from Adam to the great flood. And folks, people lived long lives in those days. During this time, we would expect some great technological advances, shouldn't we? Not like what we believe, caveman and all that sort of stuff. We already discussed that there was possible tinkering with the DNA. That's how we got the Nephilim and whatever, Fulham and weird stuff that was going on. And we keep hearing about the reptilians and all kinds of weird stuff. But you know what? They were messing with DNA. And I'm sure there were other things as well they were technologically advanced in. God commanded Noah to build an ark of gopher wood and make it waterproof with pitch. Now, the Hebrew word for ark is tibah. That's the Hebrew word. And guess what tibah means? Box. God asked Noah to build a giant, waterproof box. We know that that's what it means because the Ark of the Covenant was a box. It is called an ark, not a ship. And its main purpose was to be waterproof and to float without flipping. Although gopher wood is mentioned, it was made of a hard, dense wood whose kind has not been identified, and it was made waterproof by some yet unknown resin covering inside and out. It says pitch. But the waterproofing material or pitch would have had to be specially formulated. Folks, 1,656 years. Technology would not be beyond that. They could do that. They could formulate something. And you know why it had to be specially formulated? Because pitch, as we know it, is made from tar, a fossil byproduct that is not available yet. See, we are given the measurements in cubits, which is the distance from elbow to middle finger. Now, so we are given the measurements in cubits, the distance from elbow to middle finger, tip, fingertip. My cubit is 20 inches or 50 centimeters. That would be approximately 150 meters long, 24.5 meters wide, and 15 meters high. Also, you can see there are multiple levels, with each level having rooms for all the animals. Now, you know, Noah might have been bigger than the average man nowadays. Archaeologists have discovered that many skeletons were bigger than the average sized man today. So the cubit could have been even bigger. I doubt whether it would have been smaller. So, this may not sound like much, these cubits, but the ark was able to hold about 520 boxcars of cargo. That would be quite a long train pulled by at least 3 diesel locomotives. If people were taller, their cubits would have been longer, like I just said, and the ark would have been bigger. This was certainly not a storybook type of little boat that we find in almost any child's library. No siree, it would have been massive. The dimensions of Noah's Ark, as described in the Bible, were ideal for stability. South Korean architects who examined the dimensions found that the boat was virtually impossible to capsize, impossible to tip. Their modeling and analysis found that the ark would survive waves higher than 30 meters. 30 meters. If you're watching in the States, 30 multiplied times 3, that's 90 feet tall. Wow. Over 90 feet tall, actually. So waves higher than 30 meters. Note that the typical tsunami that took Japan just several years ago, that tsunami that went across Japan was only 10 meters high. So many other cultures have flood legends too, similar to the account of the Bible. I remember in university, that we learned about an alternate flood, the Gilgamesh flood. That's right. That weird name was actually among the Babylonians, Gilgamesh. So many other cultures have flood legends that are supposedly similar to what the Bible says. But the ark descriptions were never, ever feasible. They were from somebody's imagination, to be sure. For example, the Babylonian Gilgamesh flood legend described an ark that was shaped like a giant cube, which would be horrible for stability on the water. But God knew what he was doing. God knew what was needed. In verse 16, we read, "A window shall you make to the ark, and in a cubit shall you finish it above. And the door of the ark shall you set in the middle, with lower, second, and third stories shall you make it. 3 stories. The window was most likely an opening for light and ventilation, extending around the top of the ark, with awning-like fixtures to keep out the water coming down, a rain. The door on the side would be closed and waterproofed by God himself. After the animals were all in, and then opened again by God, 370 days later. Did you hear correctly? 370 days later is when the flood ended, or when the official ending of the flood was. That's a long time. That's a lot longer than 40 days, isn't it? The late Dr. Henry M. Morris, he was a great creation scientist, former president of the Institute for Creation Research. In the Defender Study Bible, which I also have here, had this to say about Genesis chapter 6, verse 16, which we read. The 3 decks may have been laid out as follows: large animals on the bottom, small animals and food storage on the middle deck, family quarters, possessions, and records to be kept on the top deck. Water would have been stored in cisterns on the roof and piped throughout the ark where needed. Overhead water storage would also have provided fluid pressure for various other uses. Folks, this was not some ramshackle, low-tech boat. There were technological advances in the world in those days that would have been incorporated into that ark. See, this is not beyond the scope of a 1,600-year-old civilization in an ideal environment. Remember, they were already making musical instruments and were heavily into metallurgy, as we read in Genesis 4:21-22. Besides, look at what we accomplished in North America in only 350 years in less than ideal environments. Well, that was a description of the ark. And in our next session, we will continue.